really anything the federal government does, there's now a place at the table for an Indigenous activist. Indigenous knowledge is considered equal to highly influential scientific assessments. This is a departure from standard practice.
This is Manhattan Insights, a Manhattan Institute production.
Welcome to Manhattan Insights. I'm Charles Fain Lehman, a fellow at MI and a contributing editor of City Journal, and your host for this episode. Science and its uses and abuses have been at the center of so many public disputes over the past several years. From COVID to climate change, the question of what gets to count as evidence, what science is and what it isn't, has become another partisan battleground. According to the General Social Survey, 2/3 of Democrats now report that they trust science, compared to just 1/3 of Republicans, a remarkable divergence since 2018 alone, reflecting science's increasing entry into the political realm. This is in part because the label of scientific brings with it certain respect and therefore certain benefits, both those claiming its mantle and those conferring it. But who gets to do that conferring? And in an age where science is more partisan than ever, how far can we take that term before it loses all its meaning? Are we able to recover science from its partisan abuses, or are we doomed to skepticism forever? To discuss this and other topics, I'm joined by our guest for today, Joe Simonson. Joe is a senior investigative reporter for the Washington Free Beacon. Joe, thanks so much for joining us on Manhattan Insights.
Thank you, Charles.
So the reason that we wanted to have you on the show actually focuses on a story that you reported, I guess about a month ago now, about what seems like a fairly innocuous change in the federal government's policy towards the treatment of Indigenous knowledge. So let's actually start a little bit further back. Tell our listeners a little about you, what you focus on in your reporting, what your interests are. How did you come to this story?
Sure. So, as you stated, my official title is senior investigative reporter. That's kind of a fancy way for, I guess, saying I can report on what I want. I have a lot of freedom. But one of the things that I do try to look into, or I've been looking into more and more, and what kind of inspired me for this story and a general theme I've been trying to elaborate on in recent months, is these sort of weird tensions within the Democratic Party's coalition. You mentioned in your opening remarks that Democrats overwhelmingly say they support science. They express far less skepticism of experts and supposed expertise than Republican voters or self-identified conservatives. Obviously, the coronavirus epidemic accelerated all of that, but we started seeing that a little bit more early on with the climate change debate and just general education polarization. But with that being said, the Democratic coalition is not just completely made up of white working class professionals. It's a very big country. They have a winning coalition, at least in terms of the popular vote we've seen in recent presidential elections. They've been improving very well in suburbs, but also maintaining their grip in a large part in cities. And so part of that coalition has all sorts of tensions, as I said. And so within the Democratic coalition, you have a combination of, as I already mentioned, white working class professionals, people with advanced degrees, but also normal types of groups of voters that people have always associated with Democrats. Indigenous activists, Native Indian activists, people who very much like to speak about what is called Indigenous rights. Obviously, we have Black activists, we have Hispanic activists, we have Asian activists. And so all these different disparate groups don't all actually believe the same thing, or at the very least, they understand what the Democratic Party stands for. And so they have to figure out a way to work in their own disparate beliefs into what is the Democratic Party's platform. And the Democratic Party's platform unofficially is very much, we are the party of science. And so what inspired me for this story was I've written a lot about how these tensions can create all sorts of sort of incongruous belief systems And in this example in my reporting is we have something called Indigenous knowledge or native science. And what Indigenous knowledge or native science is actually relatively hard to define because there is no such thing as just what do Native Indians or Native Americans or whoever believe. They have a wide variety of belief systems. There are hundreds of recognized tribes in the United States and the ones that are not recognized. And we have people who are part Cherokee who have no sort of connection to the Cherokee tribe as it exists today. Actually, I would guess most people who have Cherokee blood probably have very little to no connection to the Cherokee tribe today. So what Indigenous activists have been calling for the past several decades is this incorporation of something called Indigenous knowledge or native science. And it really started in the academy in sort of weird directional state university native studies departments. But what it is, at least in practice, is this idea that really old wives' tales in a lot of ways or religious beliefs that various Native peoples beliefs hold the same weight as normal scientific inquiry, that the scientific method actually has shortcomings for a variety of reasons that they chalk up to colonialism and bias, etc. And that governments, whether it's the EPA or really any government organization, should be actually using Indigenous knowledge when making policy decisions at the federal and state and local level.
So I just want to sort of summarize where you're going to say so I like the
that was a lot. Sorry.
No, it's good. It's good. I like the observation. Political scientist Matt Grossman, I talk about all the time, and David Hopkins made the argument that I find persuasive, which is that the two parties, the Republican Party is a vehicle for an ideology, whereas the Democratic Party is a collection of disparate interests.
Yeah.
In some senses, the Republican Party is it's a coalition that's constructed by an ideology, and the Democratic Party is an ideology that's constructed by a coalition. And I think what you're describing, that part of the that part of the challenge of keeping the Democratic coalition together is that sometimes you'll be called upon to reconcile disparate positions. And so one case of this is we're talking about this problem of Indigenous knowledge. I want to talk about its implementation, but first, tell me a little bit more about what could possibly be the justification for this. Where in Indigenous knowledge sounds like something. It sort of sounds like a noble savage myth. How does this stuff get up to a respectable?
That is a critique of this entire field, is that white liberals essentially believe that Native people have some sort of metaphysical connection to the land that white people are just incapable of accessing. But how it got to this level, that's a really good question, Charles. Obviously, Native American activists, I'm going to use a word and it's not really meant to be loaded, have all sorts of grievances with the federal government.
Not unjustifiably in all cases.
Yes, that was not meant to be a loaded term, but they have grievances. And a lot of those grievances obviously come back to their displacement or their perceived displacement from what they believe the land that was rightfully theirs. And so part of the liberal project, at least in recent years, and it's certainly gotten way more mainstream. I think a lot of it obviously can be traced back to 2020 when we saw all sorts of, disparate group, racial and ethnic interest groups kind of saying this is our time. But one of the idea of Indigenous knowledge and why it has gotten so much cachet and really reached the highest echelons of the federal government, under Biden is, I have a couple of theories. One is that it's one thing to say to the federal government, you have harmed, if I'm a Native person, you have harmed me by not giving me my land, or taking my land away or developing on my land or whatever. But it's another thing to say that not only have you harmed me, but you're actually harming the entire country, right? And you're harming the entire country by not taking into account Indigenous knowledge, that I actually know way more about this land, know more how to steward this land. I actually know all sorts of things that you, the colonizer, whoever, can't possibly obtain because you just don't have this deep, again, and it's metaphysical. There is a religious nature to all this, which raises all sorts of other questions to this land that I've been stewarding for, they would say, thousands of years. So this has been a bugaboo among Native activists for a very long time. I can think of all sorts of cynical reasons why, if you're a Native American activist, you would be leaning really into this idea of Indigenous knowledge. But that's basically the gist of it, that this has been something that academics have been pushing for. There have been books written about it, and they've wormed their way into the federal government. And one of the things that Biden did run was, I'm going to be the most pro-Native person president in our history. We see that with the Secretary of the Interior, who has really embraced all this stuff. We're seeing land acknowledgements at the EPA. So it's part of the general, we're an important Democratic constituency. You need to give us something.
This was the I remember there's a book that came out in 2015 called Braiding Sweetgrass, Indigenous Wisdom, Scientific Knowledge, and Teaching the Plants, which I think enjoyed a resurgence in the summer of 2020. But, was assigned in schools, so there clearly has been an uptick. But I want to zoom in on your story, what you reported on. So 2022, which is the Office of Science and Technology Policy plays a pretty key role in this.
Yeah.
The OSTP has been around since the 70s. And, I think there was a line that it sort of fell by the wayside during the Trump administration. You can tell me if you think it's accurate or not. But, the Biden administration made some moves to try to elevate it. As you report, that it was moved up to be a cabinet level agency, which is a fairly big deal. The OSTP really advises on science technology, which makes it sort of interesting what they end up doing. So talk us through OSTP's actions and the timeline of the events.
Yeah. So the OTSP thing, whether it fell by the wayside or the Trump administration, it wasn't a cabinet level agency. So the question is, what does that even mean when something that isn't a cabinet level agency falls to the wayside? I don't really know, and I'm not going to pretend I'm educated enough on the history of the OTSP and whether its role has been filled by other agencies or whatever. It's still not totally clear to me what it does today, even as a cabinet, or what role it fills that wouldn't have been filled by another cabinet level agency today. But that's not really here or there. But the elevation of the OTSP to a cabinet level agency was actually one of Biden's first moves as president. And I think it speaks to that idea that I mentioned earlier on, that Democrats come into power, COVID is still raging. Joe Biden ran on ending COVID. The follow the science, party of science mantra was solidified with Biden's victory. And because it has the word, I really do think a lot of it just has to come down to it has science in its name. Making the OTSP a cabinet level agency was meant to be this really significant, oh my gosh, this maneuver, he's really serious. But as we see in November of the following year, November 2022, the OTSP sends out this guidance that really didn't get a lot of play. It's on the White House's website, but Joe Biden wasn't doing a Rose Garden ceremony on this, even though I think it really fundamentally changed the federal government's relationship with what you and I understand as science. But that memo directs more than 24 federal agencies to apply Indigenous knowledge to, quote, research policies and decision-making. And it's a 42-page document. That document explicitly says that agencies are encouraged to speak with spiritual leaders and reject, I'm quoting, reject methodological dogma, end quote, when making policy. So when issuing rulemaking, there are meetings within the EPA where they bring in indigenous knowledge experts who say, the problem with the West is that you guys got horse blinders on. There's a whole other way to conceive of the natural world that you guys have dismissed, you being Westerners, colonizers, whoever, white people, since you came to this country. And it veers into bizarre territory, this idea that they reject the idea that time is linear. And this wouldn't matter so much, right, if the federal government and a cabinet level agency wasn't telling the EPA, wasn't telling the Department of the Interior, wasn't telling the Department of Energy that, oh, by the way, you guys really should be talking to these people when issuing a rule on an endangered species or on an oil well or on whatever. Really, anything the federal government does, there's now a place at the table for an indigenous knowledge or an indigenous activist.
And you talk specifically about the use of highly influential scientific assessment and the incorporation of indigenous knowledge into highly influential scientific assessment. That's a technical term. What does that mean?
Yeah, so that is a very technical term, and it's not one that I was not familiar with before doing research on this story, but it actually is it's a big deal. So highly influential scientific assessments are some of the most, when the United States government wants to consider a rule or regulation, they have to do generally a lot of research before issuing that rule or guidance. And people always have complaints about, whether on the left or right, how these reports come out, but they have to be done. It might feel that the government just issues rules by fiat, but there actually is sort of all these structures in place that they have, these boxes they have to check before doing that. So highly influential scientific assessments are really kind of the top of scientific reports that the federal government issues. And they're called that because if any guidance or report's recommendations, if it impacts more than $500 million worth of economic activity, it has this new category. These categories were all set up, I think, in the 80s or 90s, because prior to that, the federal government didn't really know, okay, we've like a bunch of different reports. How do we know which one is like a good report? How do we know which report is important? And so it was like a way to standardize data within federal rulemaking and the federal government. And at the top of that is highly influential scientific assessments. Now, under this guidance from the Biden administration, indigenous knowledge is considered equal to highly influential scientific assessments and may be incorporated in highly influential scientific assessments. This is a departure from standard practice. So that means, hey, like I did a pH level reading of a stream, and like this stuff from this mine makes it go up or down or whatever, the pH level, that is now equal to talking to a tribal elder who says, yeah, I've been here my people have been here for 1,000 years, and every time anything disrupts that stream, that can be catastrophic for the environment. I know that is the case. And so we don't really have any, this is all very in the early stages, and I talk about this in my piece. There's not some report or new rule that I can point to, and I've looked for them, that says, oh, look, this new regulation is because of indigenous knowledge, or indigenous knowledge was used in part of the rulemaking. The EPA and all these other agencies are still trying to figure out what exactly it means to incorporate indigenous knowledge, but the standards are already set now, that it can be. We just don't know what that looks like just yet.
Well, and it seems like they're trying to determine that there is a great deal of ambiguity around this. There's been a fair amount of internal guidance surrounding the uses of indigenous knowledge. What are people at the EPA or people at the USGS or whatever being told they need to do? What is the internal guidance, if any? Yeah,
so it's really vague, and I think that's part of the reason why. And I wrote about this in my piece, why they've had dozens of seminars across the federal government, webinars and meetings with Indigenous knowledge experts to be like, so like, what do you guys think Indigenous knowledge means? And like, how can we incorporate that into our day-to-day work? And what I really have concluded, and I'm not being flippant, it's kind of whatever an Indigenous knowledge expert or Native person says it is. And we see this. So a good example, and I talk about in my piece, is like in Canada. And Canada has a little bit more of a rigid tribal system than the United States. Tribes in Canada, I think, even have more autonomy than they do in the United
tribes
than they do
have
here.
enormous influence in Canada.
Yeah. So, a good example, I was talking to an academic in Canada who's been writing about this since like the 90s. She's been on a campaign against this. And she basically gave an example with polar bear hunting. And polar bears, everyone likes polar bears. They're very cute. But they also live in what is essentially tribal land in Canada, up most north parts of Canada. And there's Inuit tribes and all sorts up there. And the Inuits hunt polar bears because they can sell. I think their furs go for like $30,000 on the there is a fairly legal market for polar bear fur. So for years, you've had environmental activists. This is kind of actually an irony to the whole thing, that it actually can be counterintuitive, or not counterintuitive. It can counteract other left-wing environmental or goals. And Canadian government for years has been hearing from animal rights activists that polar bears are being killed and that their population is declining. And the reason, if you believe that, is because tribes up in Canada have been killing them and selling their markets to like the Chinese and all sorts of like rich Saudis or whoever. And so what happened was the Canadian government sent, various scientists and whoever to go up there and be like, hey guys, like here you guys are like killing too many polar bears. It's a big problem. We reason to believe the polar bear population is shrinking. And the Inuit tribal elders say, I've been on this land for thousands of years. You come in here, you're going to try to tell me, listen, it is not in my interest to kill all the polar bears. Obviously, I saw, how many, and then they ask, like, well, how many polar bears did you record? The native will ask the scientist, and he said, well, we say, we've recorded 10. We went all around. He's like, and the tribal elder says, well, I've seen like 20 polar bears today. You haven't seen all of them. And that sort of actual observational, through sheer observation, is actually considered a central component of Indigenous knowledge in a lot of ways. Again, there's sort of this like unique perspective that Native people have. And so the natives tell the Canadian government, like, I've seen way more polar bears than that. You don't understand. You don't know where to look. My people have been here forever. We know how to get the polar bears. It's our business. It's our livelihood. The Canadian government says, oh, okay. And so they go back, and then you have the animal rights activists screaming and shouting. And eventually the Canadian government begins licensing the amount of polar bear hides that a tribe can sell every season. And of course, the native tribes sue, saying that the Canadian government did not incorporate Indigenous knowledge enough in this decision. And I think the case is on appeal right now. But so that's kind of like an example of Indigenous knowledge and practice. And I think it's way more of a problem in Canada as well as Australia and New Zealand. It's made its way into medical schools down south. But I think if you want to look at the warning signs, those are the two places. And actually, like I said, a lot of the problems in Canada with Indigenous science, a lot of the complaints have come from environmental activists on the left, because if a native tribe wants to develop on their tribal land, it has all sorts of environmental consequences or whoever. The tribal elder can just say, no. Your Western test, like, I know what's good for my land, even if it means chopping down a bunch of rare trees or whatever that are normally protected by law.
Yeah, and part of what's interesting, so the the memo that you report on that kicked all of this off goes out of its way to observe that there are connections between indigenous knowledge and so the conventional Western scientific method. And I'm just reading here. For example, they, one, systematically understand and explain ways of knowing. Two, share attributes just as used as systematic observation, innovation, verification through repetition. Three, are derived from direct contact with the environment and evolve over time in response to new inputs. Four, share the need to make sense of the world and the desire to conduct practical and curiosity-driven investigations. Five, can use empirical approaches. And what's interesting is, the scientific method, part of its virtues is it's subject neutral. It's replicable. If I do the same study that you do, we will come to the same conclusions, at least in theory. It's agnostic, whereas it seems like the indigenous knowledge approach is prioritizing a particular perspective as more epistemically valid, even as it's claiming to be scientific in its character. So I guess, what do you make of that? How does this affect the way the federal government thinks about what science is, which so clearly touches on so many areas of regulatory concern?
It kind of makes you go crazy thinking about it, because science only refers to, basically in modern understanding, sort of the scientific method and being able to replicate findings, and it's very systematic. What indigenous science is it's essentially based off of 2 to 3 things. And the first is that it's heavily reliant on empirical observation. So because indigenous knowledge is not systematized, in other words, there is no way to do indigenous knowledge in the same way that we basically have an understanding like how to run a scientific experiment. And I'm not going to give everyone a middle school science lesson on how that works, but you have a hypothesis and all that, and you have a control group. That isn't part of indigenous science because there is no real definition of it. So it's heavily based off of empirical observation, which, to your point, there is some overlap there with what they would call Western science. In other words, obviously observations are part of the normal scientific method, but you have to have a control group and you have to replicate that or it's worthless. So it's heavily based off of empirical observation, for one. Two, it's based off of what I said earlier, which was kind of old wives' tales, and that it's these generational stories that are passed down, and that can inform how they believe they farm wheat, for example, or corn would be a good example. And then thirdly, there is a religious component to it, and that's where the metaphysical component comes in. Well, there's medical or metaphysical component in all of it, but heavily, and this is also why I think it raises constitutional issues, aside from just being bizarre, is that there's a religious component to this. And the Biden administration explicitly says there is a spiritual system, or it's a spiritual set of beliefs. And one of the things about how that religious component can impact or is part of indigenous knowledge is, for example, is that if you farm corn, you're supposed to be giving thanks to the land that gave it to you, and you shouldn't farm corn because that's disrespectful to the land. There could be other sorts of crops or whatever that are considered sacred to a certain tribe. Because again, there is no set of tribal religions. There's not one. It's not like Christianity and then there's like different sects. There's no such thing as one native religion. They have some similarities along their sort of origin stories. A lot of them believe in the great turtle and stuff like that. But there's no sort of like set. This is like, these are the rituals we all do. There's no book. There's no written language for really any native tribe until the 19th century. So that's a huge problem as well. Just in terms of how to even replicate this, how do we even know what indigenous science is? It just didn't exist really until the 19th century, the earliest sort of native writings, collection of stories that we have. But if a tribe says this land is sacred for whatever reason, that can create all sorts of problems in the federal rulemaking process, because what do you say? What do you say to that? You can't measure what is sacred and what's not sacred. It can be arbitrary. We don't know if it's even sincere, because also the way that native tribes work is it's actually very hierarchical. It's very it's a lot of them basically run as a patriarchy, where we have a council of older Native men, and they make decisions on behalf of their people. And and there's actually one important thing I want to add to that. The other problem, and again, it's in my piece, is that Native science is actually considered sacred itself. The stories, the lessons, the observations that Native people make that are considered Native science, if you're someone who believes in this, that is sacred. That's essentially proprietary information. And so the Native tribes do not want even government officials to know what that Native science is. And so there's this whole, and I watched a bunch of webinars on this, there's this whole sort of cat and mouse game where, oh, you want to know something that I know about this land? Well, what are you going to do for me? How are you going to give thanks to the land? How are you going to give thanks to my tribe? Like, Western knowledge is all about taking. I think that's a direct quote. It's about taking something from other people. And Indigenous activists believe that their method of knowing is it's much more of a partnership. And the practical problems of that in the federal rulemaking process is that Native tribes are trying to make all this immune from FOIA requests, Freedom of Information Act requests. So even if there are decisions made using Indigenous knowledge, the tribes are saying you can't share that with the public. And again, there's already sorts of constitutional issues with the concept of even bringing these people to the table. But now we run into also government transparency issues if this is really going to be part of our rulemaking.
So, I think you've sort of persuasively framed it that it's hard to argue from a scientific perspective that this makes a lot of sense. It's hard to say that from a knowledge production perspective, this makes a lot of sense. But there's another way of seeing it, as we talked about early in the conversation, from a coalitional perspective, it may make a great deal of sense. That you may see. You alluded to sort of briefly. There's a little bit of a tete-a-tete in the exchange of knowledge for something. So at an abstract level, who gets what here? How does this bind the coalition together? What is the benefit on each side? How does that stepping away from the sort of bizarreness, how is this working on that level?
Yeah, so that's a great question. I think for Indigenous activists, brings them into the highest levels of power. They now have a veto, or at least a voice, in terms of federal rulemaking in a way that they never had before. It also pays well. There was apparently University of California, one of the schools in the system there, used Indigenous knowledge experts for some study that they were doing. And this woman who was speaking on an EPA webinar was saying that they can get paid up to like $100 more than $100 an hour. So you have a whole sort of cottage industry of Native, Indigenous science, Native science consultants now. These people, or most of them are women, but these people who show up who went to these webinars, who talk with the federal government and the EPA or whoever about how to use Indigenous knowledge, they all have their little LLCs. This is not their full-time job. This is like a side gig. And so they charge X amount an hour, and they get to go around to various government agencies. They get to go around to various cities, states, and whatever, and say, okay, you guys have to do this. So let me show you what that means. And you just kind of keep bringing them along for the ride. So I think a lot of interest groups within the Democratic coalition, it can pay well to be a spokesman on behalf of a constituency, especially now if it's part of the legal apparatus or whatever, if it's part of the government code or federal code or whatever about how you have to do things. It's nice to come along and say, well, I'm actually an Indigenous knowledge expert. You have to consult with me if you want to do this project. So it pays well. So I think in that sense, it can be quite lucrative for the people who've been calling for this. But in terms of why would someone who's not a Native activist go along with this? You could chalk it up to just another, what I always call is humiliation ritual that the American left has to put up with to do anything. I think some of them sincerely believe it. I think that they can pull out. The federal government has a handful of studies, or they're not even case studies. They're not formal studies about how we talked to this tribe about how they farm their maize, and like it actually turned out that like this one tribe had better yields than like this white guy down the street. So we can totally like learn from, like, there's clearly something there. And so I think in the same way, like, why did so many people buy into the Black Lives Matter stuff, even when a lot of it was based on falsehoods? I think people can convince themselves of anything, and I think that's part of the reason why they're going along for it. And I think, as I said earlier, when Joe Biden goes out and says, I'm going to be the most pro-Native president in history, you got to show it. You can't, there's only so much you can do as president. And this is something that people have been clamoring for. And to someone like Biden, it seems like a no-brainer. Like, yeah, sure, I'll write like an executive order. But now suddenly, oh, wait, this executive order like affects everything the federal government does.
I also, and I want to get your thoughts on this. It seems to me like there's a certain political benefit as well. I mean, in the sense of public positioning, but also in the sense of Native Americans are a relatively small population, or 1% of the U.S. population, a highly concentrated population, and they're often a well-organized population, which is an ideal voting constituency. You don't really care about the Native American contribution to the electoral vote, but you certainly care about their votes in, for example, Montana, which is a heavily contested Democratic Senate seat, or Alaska, which has
yeah, it's a good idea. Or it's a good point.
House seats currently held by a Democrat. So there's certain benefits there as well, right?
Yeah, I think that's totally true. I just think that it's one of those. Some of the stuff part of Indigenous knowledge is so insipid, I guess would be a nice way of putting it, that it's one of those things that I think it's hard for they don't want to look at it. I reach out. I joked, I did another interview on this story like a month ago, but I said, I reached out to Anthony Fauci for comment, and he never got back to me. But it's one of those things where you want to like Clockwork Orange, hold their eye, all these like white liberals or whoever who have advanced degrees and who are devoted to science. They've turned into like a religion of sorts, and you just want to show, be like, this is what you think science. It's like, how can you let this happen? I mean, you and I grew up in the era of Bush era atheism, where Red America wanted. We still hear this today. I think it take on different valence a little bit, but when we grew up, it was the cutting edge of the left, at least in popular commentary, was hyper atheistic, hyper scientific. Super. Richard Dawkins would go out there, the God delusion and stuff like this, and laugh at not just Christianity, but Islam, but also pagan religions like the ones practiced by Native people today. This is a subject of laughter, but instead we've kind of inverted it, where they speak from now a place of privilege. They have a privileged perspective by simply following these sort of again, like pagan type religions that don't even have a written history. And so I think that's the thing that's sort of bizarre to me. It's just everything's been inverted.
We were coming sort of towards the end, but I want to even zoom out a little bit more. There's a very live discussion about impediments to productivity in the United States. To building things. This real resurgence of interest in supply side progressivism or supply side conservatism. As a way to sort of boost American productivity, a sense that a vetocracy is responsible for the relative position of stagnation that we're in. And this seems to me like an obvious example of that phenomenon, that the incorporation of one more interest group for exogenous purposes will contribute to the interminable process of environmental review. Do you Do you see that as a confusion of ends from the administration, or do you see that as a success? How does that, how to
Well,
where does
yeah,
how does that fit in?
this is a subject for a different podcast. I think there are a lot of confusion for ends for the administration when they're talking about their domestic ambitions, whether it's their idea of left-wing industrial policy or whatever. I think they've done all sorts of things that hurt their impediment. The way I look at the corporation, I think there are a number of roads we can go down. I think it could be in a few years we're never talking about this again, and that was just like that was a weird thing that happened, and like whatever. I think a likely road that we go down is it just becomes another interest group. If you want to do business anywhere near a native tribe or a land that a native tribe considers sacred or important or whatever, you got to pay them off. And we see that in American cities today. If you want to build an apartment, you got to reserve a certain amount of units for affordable housing, or the DOJ will often reach settlements where you have to pay some Democratic activist group or left-wing activist group as part of the settlement. That money has to go to a pool that goes to left-wing activist groups. Or even to bring a company public in California, you have to have a certain amount of women or minorities on the board or whatever. I think this is just another thing where to get business done, you have to pay part of a constituency within the Democratic Party. And the darkest road I go down, then you can get into really dark stuff where it's just like, this can get insane. We're going to be doing rain dances instead of like building dams, and there was some speculation. I'm calling it total speculation because I don't know enough about it and I don't know where it ended. But I think in Hawaii, for example, during the wildfires, there was speculation that there was concern about diverting water at the time of the fire because of sensitivities surrounding the native people there and whoever. And so that's kind of like the really dark stuff that I don't really like to think about, because I think the sky's the limit. I think this podcast is being recorded during the attacks in Israel right now, and I think we're seeing a lot of really dark stuff from the American left. And I like to, in this case, give them the benefit of the doubt. And I think giving them the benefit of the doubt here just means if you want to do business, you got to pay off someone. And I think that's the way, unfortunately, a lot of things work in this country right now.
So before we wrap up, your work is in part trying to identify this kind of story. Where else do you see this playing out outside of the Indigenous knowledge phenomenon? And where else are you looking for examples of this kind of interest group alignment having perverse effects? And where should listeners be looking for this? What are the stories that they're missing?
Yeah, so right now I think that, again, I mentioned it I had working on a whole slate of things until obviously these atrocious attacks in Israel happened. And I think, we're seeing a lot of those tensions come to the forefront. I wrote a long piece on Jesse Jackson a few months ago about how I believe Jesse Jackson sort of predicted the future of the Democratic Party way back in the 80s during his two presidential runs. And one of the things he brought to the forefront was sort of his hardline anti-Israel rhetoric. He got affirmative action placed into the official Democratic National Committee platform. People don't usually know that. So in a lot of ways, he was the forefather of sort of this militant left-wing Democratic Party that we see a lot in cities and at the national level a lot of time, unfortunately. And I think with these attacks in Israel, these terrorist attacks in Israel, with Hamas killing so many innocent people, and then the next day you're seeing Democratic Socialists of America organizing protests in their favor, explicitly in the favor of these terrorists the next day, and putting a lot of Democrats in an awkward position. I think that I unfortunately that I can't think of a better example than one of those tensions. You have so many American Jews, so many not even American Jews who vote Democrat, who look at the reaction from the left and kind of scratch their head and say, what did I get myself into? And I think there is a parallel between scientists who I spoke with, a lot of them who wouldn't even speak on the record, who are voting, who vote Democrat, who are secularists, who see the indigenous knowledge stuff, and they're like, what the hell is going on? And so, I wish I'm working on something right now. It's very quick, but I got a statement from all these pro-Palestinian. They sent me a really lengthy statement. These pro-Palestinian groups just sent me a statement sticking to their guns on the Times Square protests. They're not backing down. And I think, again, you have a president in the United States, President Biden, gave a very strong speech in favor of Israel's defense. Meanwhile, a lot of their most grassroots voters are saying that's not good. That's not good enough. We're going to continue our protests. So I think, unfortunately, that's an example that I would never have guessed until the last few days.
Okay. Well, on that cheery
Yeah,
note,
sorry.
Yeah, no, that's all right. Well, thank you, Joe, for joining us today and for this conversation.
Yeah, thank you, Charles.
I encourage your listeners to check out your work over at the Washington Free Beacon's website. That's freebeacon.com. Listeners, if you liked the conversation, please give us a 5-star review wherever you listen, and subscribe on YouTube and your podcast feeds to get future episodes of Manhattan Insights. This is Charles Fain Lehman, signing off.